thanks to all of you for having me. And a special shout out to my college roommate Hillel Green, who I see here. The topic of tonight's talk is U.S.-Israel relations in what is really a new era. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges that I think we can expect to see under this new Biden Bennett era, and some of the ways in which I think U.S.-Israel relations may improve, and then I'm happy to take any questions on anything or really talk about anything people want to talk about. There's obviously been a lot going on lately in Israel and in the U.S.-Israel relationship, and I'm really happy to expound upon anything that people want to talk about. So there's an interesting symmetry at the moment between now and the last time that there was a new Israeli prime minister, which was in spring 2009. And in spring 2009, you had Benjamin Netanyahu as the new prime minister of Israel. Of course, it wasn't his first go-around, it was his second go-around, but he was the newly elected prime minister. And then too, you had a new Israeli prime minister who was starting relatively soon into the first term of a new American president. And we have that situation again now. And I think that some of the things that happened then are instructive in analyzing what may happen next, partially because some of the dynamics are similar, but partially because I think both sides have likely learned some lessons from the way things unfolded the last time, lessons that will make them less likely to repeat some of the same mistakes. So for starters, last time this happened back in 2009, we had an American president who, from the outset, was inclined to pay very close attention to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and had very strong feelings about the need for some sort of reset in the U.S.-Israel relationship. And at the beginning, even before Prime Minister Netanyahu became Prime Minister of Israel, people may recall, even though this is at this point over a decade ago, people may recall that President Obama came into office and talked about the fact that the U.S.-Israel relationship had been unbalanced, and he wanted to restore some balance to it. And he also wanted very early on to get some sort of steps from the Israeli government that would signal to him that the Israeli government was serious about peace with the Palestinians. And on the other side of the ocean, you had a prime minister who, while again, this was the beginning of his term, he had already served a term in office back between 1996 and 1999. He had a decent familiarity with not only the United States, not only the US political system, but many of the relevant personalities involved. He'd been around a long time, even from before Prime Minister. Netanyahu had been ambassador to the United Nations. And so he, had a good sense of the way things worked here. He had a history of clashing with US presidents. He and Bill Clinton famously had a difficult relationship. And so you had a president who was new to his job, but had a very strong sense that he wanted to delve into Israeli-Palestinian issues. And you had an Israeli prime minister who was not new at his job, and was not new to the US-Israel relationship, and was also not new to clashes with American administrations or with Congress for that matter. Now, this time around, most of these variables are different, not all, but most. For starters, let's start with the Biden administration. President Biden has been around, obviously, a very long time. He is perhaps more familiar with Israeli politics and with Israeli politicians and with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than any current US politician. He not only was in the Senate for decades, and not only was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he also, of course, was vice president for 8 years during a time of a great churn in U.S.-Israel relations. And so he certainly is familiar with this subject, but unlike President Obama, President Biden really does not want to delve into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a major way. And there are a few reasons for this. One is that Biden has made a determination, and he talked about this on the campaign, that the United States is spending too much time on the Middle East. And you can see this reflected in all sorts of ways, including, even if you set aside what President Biden has said, if you look at his staffing, for instance, on the National Security Council, which is the foreign policy making body that is effectively the White House foreign policy shop, people who work on the Middle East, those positions have effectively been cut in half, and they've doubled or tripled the number of people who work on Asia. I think they've doubled the number of people who work on Europe. They've very severely cut back the number of staffers who work on the Middle East. A lot of the senior staff at the State Department or the Defense Department that would be confirmed by the Senate to work on the Middle East have not even been nominated yet. We are still, for instance, operating without a permanent assistant secretary for Near East, which is who is the top official in the State Department who deals with the region. Perhaps most strikingly, President Biden has not appointed a special envoy for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There has been a special envoy for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict almost continuously, really since President Clinton's first term. There is not one now, and President Biden and folks at the State Department have said that they don't intend to appoint one. At the moment, the current senior official of the State Department dealing with Israeli-Palestinian issues is Hadi Amr, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Israeli-Palestinian Affairs, a relatively mid-level official. So, in all sorts of ways, the Biden administration has telegraphed that it doesn't want to be involved in a terribly robust way in the Middle East, outside of Iran issues, which I'll get to in a couple of minutes, and in particular on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that comes from this sense that the Middle East is simply not as important as it once was, and that where the United States should be investing its time is really more so in Asia, to a lesser extent in Europe. But there's also been a real shift in thinking on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in general, and this is really the first administration, I think, in 3 decades that reflects this shift. And what this shift is that in the past, presidents on both sides believed that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was ripe for resolution, that it was simply a matter of coming up with the right plan, coming up with the right negotiating strategy, getting the two sides together, coming up with the right formula, and that you could, not easily, but you could have a negotiated agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. This administration does not believe that is the case, and I'll say, as a foreign policy person who's sitting right now in the DC suburbs, there is almost universal consensus among both Republican and Democratic foreign policy experts that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at this point cannot be resolved by anyone. That won't necessarily be the case down the road, but at the moment that is. And the Biden administration has embraced an approach that says we should not be wasting our time trying to get the two parties together. We shouldn't be wasting our time on fruitless negotiations. We shouldn't be expending effort on something that is doomed to fail. Instead, we should be focusing on smaller issues on the ground. But we should not be involved in a giant push to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this is also unique, as I said, in the past at least 3 decades, probably longer, of American foreign policy. since the Oslo Accords, you've had three major pushes to try to, on the US side, to try to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One under President Clinton at Camp David, one under President Bush at Annapolis, one under President Obama in 2013-14. And then I guess there's a fourth, even though the two sides never got together, which was the release of the Trump peace plan in January 2020, which was really the first comprehensive US plan to ever be released. So, you've had three major efforts and one comprehensive peace plan across the last four administrations. You are very unlikely to see any of those things from this administration. And so, that has a large impact on what US-Israel relations are going to look like, because it means that the thrust of US-Israel relations from the American side under this administration, at least in the short to medium term, are not going to be focused on solving the conflict. And in some ways, that is going to reduce tensions, and in some ways, that actually may increase tensions. And I'll talk about both of those things. On the Israeli side, you also have a fundamentally different situation than we had the last time we had a new Israeli prime minister. Prime Minister Bennett is, first of all, he's the first Israeli prime minister in history to not come from one of the two largest parties in the Knesset. He is not only not coming from one of the two largest parties in the Knesset, he is not even representing one of the two or three largest parties in his own coalition. And so his position is much more constrained and constricted than other Israeli prime ministers who have been in the job, because he doesn't have a large base of support, either in terms of sheer number of voters or in terms of Knesset seats. He's only at this point representing 6 Knesset seats that he brings to the coalition. He doesn't have a large base of support to sort of back him up if he gets out on a limb. Second, this is also probably the Israeli prime minister who has the least experience with the United States upon taking office. Israeli prime ministers in the past have had either lots of experience coming to the US for various reasons on Israeli government business, or they've been former defense ministers or former foreign ministers or defense attaches in the US embassy. With Prime Minister Bennett, he knows the US well since his parents are American Olim from San Francisco, and he himself lived in New York New Jersey, actually, I think, for 5 or 6 years when he was working in high tech. But he doesn't have an enormous amount of experience with the American political system or with US politicians as an Israeli politician. He has been in DC a few times in the past few years. I've myself have met with him in DC, I think, 3 times in the past 5 or 6 years, but he's not here a lot, and he's not very well known. And so that also means that he doesn't necessarily have the same well of relationships to draw upon, or the same well of experience to dwell upon, to draw upon in terms of his dealings with the United States. Third, this Israeli coalition is the widest coalition in Israeli history, in the sense that it is comprised of 8 parties. That is unprecedented. And these 8 parties are literally across the entire range of the Israeli political spectrum, ranging from Meretz, which is the most left-wing Jewish party in Israel, to Yamina, which is and Tikva Chadasha, which are the 2 most right-wing non-Kahanist political parties in Israel, and includes Ram, an Arab Islamist party. So, this coalition is unprecedented. And because of the unprecedented nature of this coalition, and the fact that you have this structure of Prime Minister Bennett and then alternate Prime Minister Yair Lapid, who serves as foreign minister for 2 years and then takes over as prime minister after 2 years. Because you have this structure with these 2 blocks, one right-wing bloc and one centrist bloc that also speaks for the left-wing parties, they have incorporated in the coalition agreements mutual vetoes on both sides. So basically, irrespective of what Prime Minister Bennett's preferences may be on any issue, unless there is consensus across the two main blocs in this coalition, they each have a veto over what happens. And so there's not a whole lot of room for maneuvering. And that means that there isn't a whole lot of room for maneuvering that is instigated by the Israeli side, but there also isn't a whole lot of room for maneuvering in response to pressure or demands or requests from the American side. And that is also very different from what we saw in 2009. And so, the fundamental situation we're faced with is a US president who doesn't want to delve too deeply into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is also generally on the rightward flank of the Democratic Party when it comes to Israel issues, something that I don't think could be said for President Obama. And you have an Israeli government that, even if it wanted to upend the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a fundamental way, in either direction, either to annex the entire West Bank and declare one state from the river to the sea, or to unilaterally withdraw from every single settlement and declare a unilateral two-state solution absent negotiations, neither of those things would be able to happen in the context of this current coalition. And so this effectively means that when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we are likely to see, I won't call it status quo because there really is no status quo. That's a myth. It doesn't exist. It's literally a daily moving target. But I don't think we're going to see giant flips in either direction. And the fact that we're not going to see giant flips in either direction takes one of the large elements of stress out of the US-Israel relationship. Because over the past two administrations, during the Obama administration, when you had a relatively high degree of tension in US-Israel relations, and then during the Trump administration, where you had almost no tension in the US-Israel relationship from the White House, with the exception of China issues, which people don't realize, but actually was a very big deal between Trump and Netanyahu. So much so that the Trump White House actually threatened sanctions quietly on the Israeli government over China. You still had an enormous amount of stress between the US and Israel when it came to Congress as a result of policies that were being pursued by the White House in conjunction with the Israeli government. And so, in both directions, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was causing issues. Whether those issues were between the White House and the Prime Minister's office, or whether those issues were between Congress and the Prime Minister's office. This time around, I don't think we're going to see very much of that. But what we are likely to see is stress on some of the kind of lower scale elements that have tended to actually fall by the wayside in US-Israel relations when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because the US has traditionally been focused on the peace process and on solving the large final status issues. And because this administration is determined not to wade into peace talks and not to touch these final status issues and not to try to get a peace agreement between the two sides, what you see coming from this administration instead is a focus on smaller things. And people may have noticed that President Biden and Secretary Blinken have tended to use and repeat a phrase that talks about equal measures of security, freedom, prosperity, and dignity for Israelis and Palestinians. And what people have been interpreting that in all sorts of ways. But what it actually means, the way the Biden folks are using it, is the idea that there are small things on the ground that need to be changed, and that have largely been ignored in the past. And these are the kinds of things that the administration is likely to press the Israeli government on. And the question is going to be whether this coalition, as it is set up, is placed in any robust way to deal with it. We saw this a bit before the recent fighting between Israel and Hamas, where for months you had in the news the issue of evictions in Sheikh Jarrah. And that was an issue that in the past really wouldn't have gotten much focus either by the White House or by Congress. What we saw in the months leading up to the fighting in May were statements from the White House, but even more so, statements from members of Congress about evictions in Sheikh Jarrah. And an issue like that is the sort of thing that when you're focused on final status peace talks, doesn't really get a lot of attention. But when you're focused on talking about equal measures of freedom, security, prosperity, and dignity, the notion of focusing on the eviction of 8 families from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah is something that then takes on greater importance. And it's an issue that can, relatively quietly and relatively painlessly be solved. But, within the context of US-Israel relations, neither we nor the Israeli government is generally used to having blow-ups over small issues like this. And so I think we're probably going to see more such disagreements over issues like evictions in Sheikh Jarrah, over issues like demolitions of homes in Silwan, over issues like the permitting process for Palestinians in Area C, issues that, things that are not on most people's radars, things that generally escape almost everyone except for kind of, a small circle of policy experts in DC and journalists who are on the ground and focused on this stuff. These are the kind of things that I think we're likely to see. And, the question going forward is whether they will be handled in a quiet manner or a not quiet manner. If they're handled in a relatively quiet manner, then I think we're probably going to see a level of relative equanimity in US-Israel relations, notwithstanding the fact that Prime Minister Bennett is coming at this from a very different ideological space than President Biden. But if these are issues that tend to get very publicly elevated and force this very unwieldy 8-party far left to far right coalition to have to respond in a public way, then that's the kind of thing that is going to turn the US into a political football in Israel in ways that we saw during Obama's second term. Now, the other issue, of course, that is going to be very much front and center, and this is one where actually I think there's probably less of a chance of a big blow up, ironically, is Iran. Iran was the thing even more so than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that caused tension between the US and Israel during the Obama administration. And now that President Biden is in office and seems to be determined to come to some sort of deal with Iran, whether it's re-entering the JCPOA or whether it's negotiating, a longer and stronger, as the term that's being thrown around, a longer and stronger deal. There is a real shift, unsurprisingly, from the Trump administration approach when it comes to Iran. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu, until a week and a half ago when he was still in office, his approach to this was similar to his approach during the Obama administration when the JCPOA, the Iran deal, was initially negotiated. The Israeli government approach at the time was that no deal would be acceptable, and as a result, Prime Minister Netanyahu's approach was to work against any deal as opposed to trying to put Israel in a position to influence the deal that eventually emerged. And when President Biden took office this time, Prime Minister Netanyahu effectively embraced the same approach, where at the beginning of the administration, the Biden folks asked the Israeli government for input on what they would like to see in JCPOA negotiations. And Prime Minister Netanyahu's response was that the Israeli government wasn't going to give its views on JCPOA or what should be in a deal. Its view was that no deal should be negotiated. Now, what we have already seen under Prime Minister Bennett and Foreign Minister Lapid, who I mentioned because I think that Lapid is probably the one who's driving this, is to say that the Israeli government has very strong concerns about, obviously, the Iranian nuclear program and about any U.S. effort to re-enter the JCPOA or even to negotiate a different deal. But in contrast to Prime Minister Netanyahu's approach, which was to say no deal is ever going to be good, and so we're not going to engage on the substance of a deal, Prime Minister Bennett, one of his first moves was to send IDF Chief of Staff Aviv Kochavi to DC. He has been here, I think he may have left today, but he arrived on Sunday. He was here for 2 days of meetings with both civilian and military officials at the Pentagon. And the thrust of those meetings was to not only talk about things like Iron Dome replenishment and missiles in Lebanon and Syria, but to relay the Israeli government's views on what a better deal would look like and what the Israeli government would like to see the JCPOA address. And that is a fundamental shift. And what that ultimately is going to mean is that if the United States re-enters the Iran deal, it is going to cause tension with Israel. Make no mistake, the Israeli consensus on this across the political and security establishments is that the JCPOA was deeply flawed, and that if it is re-entered now without adjustment, it will be even more deeply flawed, given that 6 years have passed since the original deal was negotiated, and since many of the sunset clauses are approaching even faster. So it isn't as if there is a large contingent in Israel that's saying, hey, U.S., go rejoin the JCPOA. So it is going to cause tension. There's no question about that. The question is whether that tension is going to lead to a public blowup, or whether the United States and Israel can manage a process that says, the U.S. re-enters the JCPOA, Israel thinks it's a mistake, but the two countries together manage what happens next in terms of not only a longer and stronger follow-on agreement, but in terms of monitoring Iranian compliance or non-compliance with the JCPOA or any deal that's negotiated, and making sure that there is much stronger coordination between the U.S. and Israel than there was last time. And that, I think, is almost certainly going to happen. And so it's not going to remove disagreements over policy toward Iran, not by any long shot. But it is going to remove this variable where, in some ways, the political incentive inside of Israel was to set the U.S. up as something to inveigh against, which is something that Prime Minister Netanyahu did effectively, and has actually continued. He's continued in his week and a half as opposition leader to do. I think that you're simply not going to see that from Bennett and Lapid. So there are other issues that are going to touch upon this, of course. I think that there's an interesting angle to the way American Jews are going to relate to this new Israeli government, and how that may or may not impact a U.S. government stance and U.S. foreign policy. And I also think that we are very likely to see Israeli diplomatic appointments in the United States that are done with an eye toward American Jewish concerns, something that I'm not sure was a hallmark of Prime Minister Netanyahu's tenure. We've actually already seen one. Yesterday it was announced that Asaf Zamir is going to be the new Israeli Consul General in New York. Asaf Zamir is a former deputy mayor of Tel Aviv. He was also elected to the Knesset under Kahol Lavan back in the first election in April 2019. So and he's somebody who knows the American Jewish community pretty well, and I think one or both of his parents also might be American, if I'm remembering that correctly. So I think we're going to see an effort to really pay more attention to the American Jewish community writ large, and that's going to have downstream effects as well. But I want to make sure that I am able to answer any questions people have. So I will stop there, and people can either put questions in the chat, or you can unmute and ask me directly. And as I said, I'm happy to answer questions on really everything and anything. So all right, I see we have a few here now in the chat. The first question from Shira Goldman: do you see any extension of the Abraham Accords under the Biden administration? Also, are there factors that you see that could arise that could draw the Biden administration further into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than they prefer? Both very good questions. So the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords were in a lot of ways the low-hanging fruit that existed. Because what you had with the Abraham Accords were one country, the United Arab Emirates, that had gone already much farther down the road of normalization with Israel, both publicly and privately, than any other state, aside from, of course, Egypt and Jordan, that have peace treaties, than any other state in the region. You had Bahrain, which is effectively a trial balloon state for Saudi Arabia. And you had Sudan, which wasn't actually interested in normalization with Israel. That agreement has actually still not been signed. What it wanted was a big concession from the United States, which was to have Sudan removed from the US state sponsor of terrorism list, and to have law passed by Congress granting Sudan immunity from any anti-terrorism lawsuits in the United States, aside from those arising from 9/11. And the Trump administration was willing to give that to Sudan, and so Sudan was willing to sign the Abraham Accords, even though the actual agreement normalizing relations with Israel has not been signed. And then you had Morocco, which was actually not a new normalization agreement. Morocco normalized relations with Israel in the 1990s. It then suspended those relations in 2001 at the beginning of the Second Intifada, and its role in the Abraham Accords was to agree to unsuspend those relations that had been suspended since 2001. So, that was a case of a country that had already established diplomatic relations with Israel nearly 2 decades ago. I'm sorry, more than 2 decades ago. So, this was the low-hanging fruit. Now, in order to expand the Abraham Accords, you need states that either don't have a domestic issue when it comes to normalizing with Israel. And if you think of a state like the UAE, the UAE has 9 million people living there, only 1 million of whom are actually citizens. So, it doesn't have a huge amount of people. The government doesn't have a huge amount of people that it needs to be responsive to. And those 1 million citizens are, overwhelmingly wealthy, educated, worldly, sort of the perfect demographic for normalizing relations with Israel. There aren't that many countries in the region that are similarly situated in terms of having normalized relations with Israel not be a domestic political issue. The other complication is that the Abraham Accords were set up to purposely bypass the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because Israel did not want the Palestinian issue to be a barrier to it being accepted throughout the region. I'm sure everybody on this webinar would agree, understandably so. And the UAE in particular did not want to have its bilateral relations subject to a Palestinian veto. And from the Trump administration perspective, the Abraham Accords came together relatively late in the game after it became clear that the Trump plan was really a non-starter and dead in the water. And so this was, in some ways an effort to get a diplomatic win, and in some ways an effort to punish the Palestinians for their intransigence in engaging with the Trump administration. When you look at other states that are candidates to normalize with Israel, and people mention Saudi Arabia is obviously the biggest prize out there. People have also mentioned Qatar, given that the Qataris deal with the Israelis, in Gaza pretty intently. People have also mentioned Tunisia, given the large presence of Jews of Tunisian descent within Israel. These are all countries that are much more sensitive to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that have all said publicly, and I can also tell you they all say privately, that without progress on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, normalizing with Israel is going to be very difficult for them. And so I think there is a world in which the Abraham Accords can be, expanded upon, but I think that it's difficult to see that happening without some sort of progress on the Palestinian front. And I don't think that means, a final status agreement. It doesn't mean the establishment of a Palestinian state, but it does mean Israeli concessions on different things depending on which country we're talking about. The Saudis, for instance, are very sensitive to Jerusalem in particular, and many of the Israeli activities in East Jerusalem would have to be severely curtailed for the Saudis to be able to take any real public steps toward normalization with Israel. So, I think that the fundamental architecture of the Abraham Accords, which was casting Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the side, is unlikely to work for future states. I think that that architecture is going to have to be rethought if the Abraham Accords are going to be expanded upon. And I know from talking to folks in the administration that they are actively working on trying to do it. There was actually a meeting today between Dan Ben-Haim, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Gulf Affairs, and Anwar Gargash, who is the Emirati Minister for Foreign Affairs. And the public readout of their meeting was that they were discussing ways to expand normalization. So the administration is actively and publicly working on it, and I think that it's also possible we'll see in the months ahead a special envoy appointed to work on this specifically. But I think it's going to be tougher to do so without real progress on the Palestinian front. On the second question, factors that could draw the administration further into the conflict than they prefer. So we've already seen it. We saw it with the fighting in Gaza. And the administration, I think, took the right approach in terms of the short-term goals of giving Israel space to do what it wanted to do in Gaza, and then getting a relatively quick ceasefire. But the administration does not want to have to deal with more episodes like that. And if there is more fighting between Israel and Hamas, and the way things have been proceeding over the past couple of weeks, I think that that's an increasingly likely scenario in the short term. That will draw the administration in for sure. And the other big thing that will draw the administration in, I should say two, and in some ways they're related. One would be large-scale unrest or even an intifada in the West Bank. And the other, which if it happens very well may lead to that scenario, would be the death or replacement in some way, shape, or form of Mahmoud Abbas and a messy Palestinian leadership transition. Because when Abbas goes, however it happens, it is not likely to be a quiet or easy process. That was the case in the transition from Arafat to Abbas. If anybody's read the extremely excellent biography of Mahmoud Abbas called The Last Palestinian by Grant Rumley and Amir Tibon, they talk in there sort of about the kind of luck that was involved in having Abbas very quickly assume undisputed Palestinian leadership of the PLO and Fatah and the PA. I see almost no way that happens again. And if there is a messy Palestinian leadership struggle between different personalities and different factions. And by the way, we got a preview of this during the canceled Palestinian elections, where Fatah fractured into 3 different groups, which I think is a pretty good indication of what we're going to see when Abbas goes. That will lead to Palestinian infighting and potentially to civil unrest and civil war, and even maybe an intifada. And if that happens, then the administration is going to get drawn into Israeli-Palestinian conflict issues in a real way. The types of things on the Israeli side that could draw the administration in, and the big one there would be something like annexation. As I said before, that's despite Bennett's position on annexation, that simply cannot happen in the current coalition setup, and so that kind of thing doesn't worry me nearly as much. Next question from Hillel Green. While the coalition government in Israel doesn't have power to take steps, do they feel any of the pressure via public media, local politicians, etc., that the Biden administration has been relieved of to make even superficial moves toward resolution? So they really don't. One of the other things that has shifted within the Israeli political context in the past decade is it's 2 things actually. One is an increasing sense within Israel, similar to the sense that I think is, as I said before, prevalent within U.S. foreign policy circles, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is just nowhere close to being ripe for resolution. It's one of the reasons why the peace camp in Israel is now effectively non-existent. It's why over 4 successive election campaigns, you heard almost nothing about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's simply not an issue that is front and center anymore. There is no real public pressure to make moves in either direction. There's more pressure, I think, at this point from the right to deepen Israel's hold over the West Bank than there is coming from the left to loosen Israel's hold over the West Bank. But there really isn't much pressure to do very much. The second thing that has changed, and it follows from the first, is that nobody on the right at the moment is worried that there is another Oslo around the corner. Nobody on the right is worried that there is another Gaza disengagement around the corner. The idea that Israel's hold on the West Bank is in any way tenuous or threatened, that notion is really gone. And one of the most amazing ways in which this manifested was when the Trump plan was released. You had a split within the Israeli right, where one part of the Israeli right said, wow, the Trump plan calls for annexation of 30% of the West Bank on day 1 up front. This is something that we never imagined the US would ever greenlight. This is fantastic. Let's take it right away. We're never going to get anything like this. And the other part of the Israeli right said, this is not nearly enough. The Trump plan contemplates the possibility of a Palestinian state. And so we're going to hold out until the United States tells us that we can have, either all of Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, or the entirety of the West Bank. Now, if you think about this in the context of, U.S. diplomacy on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that second position is literally bonkers. But the idea that there's any danger to Israeli control of most of the West Bank is just so far out of sight, out of mind that I think on the Israeli side expectations have been warped, and so what that means is that there's no pressure to make any moves in the West Bank, but it also conversely does create some space if the Biden administration decides they want to press on some smaller issues. It creates some space for progress to be made, because if the Bennett-Lapid coalition decides, for instance, to cancel a bunch of demolition orders in Area C, nobody on the Israeli right thinks that that is a harbinger of an Israeli pullout of settlements, or an Israeli turnover of parts of Area C to the Palestinian Authority. And so, this is a bit of a counterintuitive point, but I do think that it creates some space for things to happen if the Biden administration decides to prioritize, some small and very specific things. Next question from Andrew. I don't know how, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, Lachow, Lachow. What can you tell us about Thomas Nides, nominated to be the next US ambassador to Israel? Tom Nides doesn't have a lot of firsthand experience in Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He worked in the State Department as an assistant secretary for 2 years during the Obama administration. He was largely working on kind of procurement and logistics. So he did deal with things like US weapons transfers to the Israeli government, but he wasn't really working on kind of the hardcore diplomatic issues. He did spend decades as a very high-level Hill staffer to Hill leadership, to Democratic leadership. So, he certainly is familiar with foreign policy issues, the Middle East, Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As an American Jew, he, like many American Jews, has a deep familiarity with Israel and experience with Israel. But he's definitely not somebody who has been considered up until this point to be someone who's deeply invested in Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. But he does know the issue, and he does know a decent number of folks on the Israeli side. I think more importantly, and this is really what's most important for an ambassador, and we saw this both with Ambassador Friedman and with Ambassador Shapiro, the previous two ambassadors to Israel. What's important is that the Israeli government has a sense that the ambassador to Israel has a real direct line to the Secretary of State and to the president, and that they are speaking for the administration and not sort of, going off on their own. And given that Tom Nides, worked very closely with Secretary Blinken when they were both high-level State Department officials in the Obama administration, and the fact that he knows President Biden, going back decades, I think that that's probably actually the most important factor here. And I don't think that there is going to be any doubt on the part of Israeli government officials that he is relaying the wishes of the White House and the State Department. And when he speaks, he is speaking for the administration, and what he says is authoritative. Another question from Andrew. What impact will the election of Ibrahim Raisi, that's the new Iranian president, alleged to have been involved in the murder and torture of tens of thousands of dissidents, political prisoners, activists, mothers and children imprisoned or opposed to the regime during his term as prosecutor in Tehran, to the Iranian presidency have on the Iran deal, U.S.-Iran relations, and U.S.-Israel relations. So I'll say up front, I'm certainly not an expert on domestic Iranian politics, so I can comment on some of this, but not on all of it. So when it comes to the Iran deal, there are basically two views on how Raisi's election is going to impact things. One is that as a hardliner, as somebody who is seen as probably now the leading candidate to take over as supreme leader from Ali Khamenei when he dies, that it's going to be much harder to get to some sort of agreement. It was widely assumed in 2015 that the fact that you had Khamenei as supreme leader and you had Rouhani as president and Zarif as foreign minister, who were seen as the more pragmatic camp, that they were the ones in the pragmatic camp who were pushing for some sort of deal. Now you have unified hardline rule, and so that's going to make it harder. There's another view of this that says that because you actually are going to have more agreement between all elements of the Iranian government, it may actually make it easier for the Iranian government to enter a deal, because you don't have the same kind of political splits and you don't have the same kind of political pressure. You don't have another party that can, and by party I don't mean political party, I mean faction, that can benefit within Iran, if the Iran deal goes south for the Iranian economy or Iranian security. My sense is that as a result of the uncertainty, the Biden administration is now going to push much harder than they have been to try to conclude a deal in the next few weeks. But I think that a lot of this is definitely going to be on the Iranian side. I tend to take the view that that even hardline Iranian leadership at this point probably wants to re-enter the JCPOA, given the pressures on the Iranian economy, and that they're willing to do this and sort of get the short-term benefit that lifting sanctions will bring, and they'll worry about the rest of it later. But as I said, I'm certainly not an expert on domestic Iranian affairs, so I don't say that with a high level of confidence. In terms of U.S.-Israel relations, as I said before, I think that the real action here doesn't have to do with who's in power in Iran. I think it has to do with the approach that's going to be taken between Biden and Bennett and Lapid on how to manage the differences over Iran. And on that front, it doesn't really matter who the supreme leader is, and it doesn't really matter who the Iranian president is. What matters is whether the Israeli government is willing to kind of trade the public posturing that was characteristic of Prime Minister Netanyahu's approach for actual influence within U.S. political circles on how the U.S. deals with Iran going forward. And that's, as I said, really a function of U.S.-Israel in a way that's going to be siloed from whoever's in power in Iran. The next question, given the ways that Israel has been turned into a political wedge issue among American Jews, how do you expect the new Israeli government to try and manage a democratic administration given the small though vocal progressive anti-Israel left? It's a very good question. So I think that something that certainly Yair Lapid understands is that while you do have, as the question says, a small, or I should say a vocal progressive anti-Israel left, it remains relatively small. And not only does it remain relatively small, within the context of actual influence over policy, it has less influence than you can even imagine. For starters, President Biden is completely not on board with the approach taken by the progressive left on Israel. He was probably of every single Democrat who ran for president during the last election cycle, he was probably the one who was farthest to the right side of the Democratic Party on Israel issues. Kamala Harris and Cory Booker were probably tied for a close second. And so, when it comes to the presidency and the executive branch, and this extends certainly to Tony Blinken, when it comes to the presidency and the executive branch, you really don't have any real voices or progressive influence when it comes to Israel issues. And within Congress, the Squad and other congressional Democrats, who take similar positions, are certainly loud, but most of them are relatively junior. They aren't in Democratic leadership. They don't control committees. They don't have the ability to get legislation passed. They don't have the ability to get legislation, through committees to the floor, let alone actually passed on the floor. If you look at some of the bills that are in front of Congress now that have worried the pro-Israel community, things like the Betty McCollum bill, which focuses on is IDF detention of children, and that calls for new usage restrictions on the way U.S. security assistance to Israel can be used. That bill right now has, I think off the top of my head, it's either 13 co-sponsors or 23 co-sponsors. I don't remember the exact number, but the point is, it is barely double digits. So, for all of the noise that has been coming about security assistance to Israel and allegations that that Israel practices apartheid and that sort of stuff, it really is confined to a vocal but small corner of Congress, and that is something that I know firsthand. Yair Lapid understands, and what I think we're likely to see in terms of managing relations with Democrats is, number one, a very strong commitment from the Israeli government, from all sides of this coalition, from the right, the center, and the left, to try to make sure that Israel has strong relations with both Republicans and Democrats. That is something that, to put it politely, was not a hallmark of Prime Minister Netanyahu's approach. And that is not something that is kind of a feature of the Israeli right. That was a feature of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Naftali Bennett, Gideon Sa'ar, Zev Elkin, all sorts of people on the Israeli right who are farther to the right than Netanyahu on things like Israeli-Palestinian issues, have been very vocal for years about the need to have strong relations with the Democratic Party. And so I think that we're going to see commitment across the Israeli political spectrum to taking a more bipartisan approach. I also think that there's going to be certainly push within the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and I think probably from the Israeli Defense Ministry as well, which remains controlled by Benny Gantz. I think we're probably going to see a push to try to address some of the smaller issues that the Biden administration is likely to raise. Something that Prime Minister Netanyahu did, which is also unprecedented within Israeli political history, was centering power in the Prime Minister's office to an unprecedented degree. The Israeli Prime Minister is generally it's not a presidential system, right? The Prime Minister traditionally and historically is first among equals, but requires consensus within the cabinet to do things, and that was even the case for Prime Minister Netanyahu from 2009 until at least 2013, and maybe really until 2015. One of the main reasons why, for instance, Israel did not bomb Iranian nuclear facilities back in 2011 and 2012 is because there was an 8-person security cabinet, and it was divided 4-4 on whether Israel should go ahead and strike Iranian nuclear facilities. And despite the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Barak were 2 of the 4 who were in favor, it didn't happen because it simply couldn't happen under the way the Israeli cabinet generally works. And particularly now with Prime Minister Bennett, as I noted before, being in a lot of ways the weakest Israeli prime minister in history, given the size of his Knesset faction and the size of the coalition, he's also not going to be able to act without consensus. And what that means is that issues that are historically under the purview of the defense ministry, and that's really everything and anything in the West Bank, are going to be under the control of Benny Gantz. And I think that Benny Gantz is likely to be more receptive to democratic concerns on some of these issues, and I think that will also, go a long way toward healing some of the fissures that have taken place over the past decade between the Democratic Party and Israel. And I also think that, a lot of folks in the new Israeli coalition recognize the importance of American Jews within Democratic Party politics, recognize that issues that are of great concern to most American Jews, and certainly most American Jews outside of the Orthodox community, on the Kotel, on conversions, on recognition of conservative and reform streams of Judaism. I think those are things that the coalition is likely to address pretty quickly. They've already said that they're going to restore the Kotel compromise. So I think that they're going to be smart and strategic in how they address those, understanding that if they get American Jews on their side on the issues that go beyond the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, issues that have just been causing angst between Israel and diaspora Jewry, that will also have downstream impacts on the Democratic Party and on Democratic Party politics. Question from Sarah. can you speak to the claim made recently by former Israeli ambassadors to South Africa that Israel's policies constitute apartheid? So I disagree. I disagree with the apartheid charge for a number of reasons. First of all, the Human Rights Watch report that declared Israel being guilty of practicing apartheid explicitly made no distinction between Israeli activities beyond the Green Line and Israeli activities inside the Green Line, and did not address the fundamentally different situation between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians who are subject to Israeli control and don't have citizenship. Now, that is not to suggest in any way, shape, or form that Israeli control of the West Bank and Israeli occupation of between 2.5 and 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank is not a problem. In my view, it's an enormous problem and it needs to be addressed. But I don't see how you can sustain a charge that Israel is practicing apartheid, which by definition is based on supremacy and differentiation of treatment along ethnic and racial lines, when you have 20% of the population of Israel, or I say 20% of the citizens of Israel, who are Arabs and not Jews. So I think on its face, that is a charge that is impossible to sustain. Now, I understand, I read the article by Alon Liel, and the name of the other Israeli ambassador is escaping me at the moment. I read their piece, and I understand, when they talk about the fact that the situation on the ground in the West Bank, in terms of having separate pockets of Palestinians, who are separate from Israeli Jews, and how the fact that if you are an Israeli Jew living inside the West Bank, you have full citizenship rights, and if you are a Palestinian living in the West Bank, you don't. I understand how in many ways that does resemble the way things looked in South Africa during apartheid. But again, this ends up being a question of differentiation of treatment, not because of racial categories or ethnic categories. It's differentiation of treatment based on nationality. And nationalism is something that, exists in full force all over the world. And it's almost always messy. It's almost always ugly. But, there certainly is differentiation across the globe based on nationality and national rights. And again, to be clear, that does not in any way obviate the obligation of the Israeli government to address the fact that we are now in year 54 of what is supposed to be a temporary military occupation of the West Bank. It does not obviate the need for the Israeli government to respect the fact that international law dictates things that Israel can and cannot do in territory that it militarily occupies. It does not obviate the need for the Israeli government to address the fact that having people who are under your control but do not have citizenship rights, or even basic freedoms in many ways for over half a century. And again, not to place all the blame on Israel for this. We can spend another hour and a half simply talking about kind of how both sides are responsible. But the fact of the matter is that Israel does have an obligation to address this and to correct the imbalance, and to do a better job of providing basic rights and freedoms for Palestinians who are under its control. That doesn't make this apartheid. It does make it problematic. It does make it something that has to be addressed. It does make it something that people should look at and think about, and and speak up about, in ways that are appropriate and that feel productive. But it does make it apartheid, and I don't think that charge is accurate as a matter of fact or history, or in terms of the actual international definition of what apartheid is. That is all the questions that are currently in the chat. I'm happy to take more if people have them. But if not, I guess I will turn things back over to Sarah.
I mean, I wanted to just close by asking the question of whether where there's room for hope, not naive hope, but realistically grounded hope, and what role as you see American Jews playing in that.
So there are a few things that I think give me hope for the future. The first is that despite the real unrest between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs that we saw last month, we are also now witnessing something that is not precedented in Israeli history, which is the inclusion of an Arab party, an independent Arab party, in an Israeli government. And I think that the more that Israeli Jews internalize the idea that Israeli Arabs are full citizens of Israel and have every right to participate in Israeli politics and Israeli society and Israeli democracy in a full way, and the more that Israeli Arabs internalize that they can and should be participating in Israeli politics and Israeli society and Israeli democracy in a full way, I think that that will not only redound to Israel's benefit, inside Israel proper. I think, and I'm hopeful, that it will go a long way toward allowing Israelis and Palestinians to see each other as legitimate and to understand that they both have to share this land, that neither side is going anywhere, and that the way forward is not going to be through endless conflict. The way forward is not going to be through terrorism. The way forward is not going to be through oppression or denial of basic rights and freedoms. The way forward is going to be recognizing the fundamental rights of each, and hopefully, from my perspective, resulting in a safe, secure Jewish democratic Israel living alongside a safe, secure, democratic, independent Palestine. And we're a long ways off from that. But I think that these trends within Israel, hopefully provide some light for moving forward. The second thing that I think gives me hope, and this is on this is on the American Jewish Israel spectrum, and goes to the second part of your question, is that for all of the talk about distancing between Israel and American Jews, and if anybody here, Sarah maybe has heard me say this before, but I say this in front of audiences all the time. We are living in a golden age of, as American Jews, being able to engage with Israel in ways that were impossible throughout Jewish history until about 10 or 15 years ago. If you want to read Israeli daily newspapers in either Hebrew or English, you can do that, by opening a web browser. If you want to watch Israeli news live, you can do that from your computer. If you want to watch the same TV shows and watch the same movies that Israelis are watching, you can do that on multiple streaming services. If you want to listen to the same music Israelis are listening to, you can do that, at the drop of a hat. We have such an ability, and of course, the fact that we live in an era where you can hop on a direct flight to Israel from New York, DC, Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami. I think there are probably some others that I'm missing, and be there in under 11 hours. Our ability to engage with Israel and to really understand Israel and to immerse ourselves in the same things that Israelis are immersed in, our ability to do this is almost absolute. And I think that, that in itself does cause problems because it allows us to see things that go on in Israel that we may not like, that were in many ways impossible to see or to know 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, 5 decades ago, certainly 7 decades ago. But it also allows us to engage with Israel in a much deeper way, and in a much more robust way, and in a much more familiar way. And I think that yes, that will lead, that will and has led to some complicated feelings, but I think that over time, for those who seek it out, and we all have, as I said, an unprecedented opportunity to seek it out, it will also lead to, I think, a much deeper and more robust engagement with and appreciation of Israel. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we are living in miraculous times. In the scope of Jewish history, having a sovereign Jewish state in the Jewish homeland almost never happens. And we take it for granted. And I think that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we are incredibly privileged to be living in this time, and that we can actually engage with that Jewish sovereign state in the Jewish homeland, and not only engage with it, but really be part of its day-to-day life and its future. And I think that both the new Israeli presidents, Bougie Herzog, and the new Israeli government understand this fact, and I think that they are going to do their best and go a long way toward trying to involve American Jews in Israel in a more fundamental way. And at the end of the day, that will only make Zionism stronger, will only make American Jewry stronger, and will only make the American Jewish connection to Israel stronger, all of which, from my perspective, are undeniably good things.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I encourage you to check out Michael's writings at the Israel Policy Forum. And again, thanks for speaking with us. It's been a real, it's been such an incredible learning opportunity.
My pleasure. Happy to do it anytime. And thank you so much for inviting me. Good night, everyone.
Have a good night, everybody.